Those of you who don't know me, my name's Sam Drerup. I'm a professor here at Trine University. My area of expertise is not plants and people, but it is in fact aquatic ecology. My research is always focused on water quality issues as well as remediation or improvement issues regarding fresh water. So, why did I decide to talk about lakes today? Well, lakes are hugely important to Steuben County, so this talk will pretty much focus exclusively on Steuben County. And so this is basically all the lakes that we have within the district, boundaries of Steuben County. We like to say like there's 101 lakes here, and that's even the tagline of our tourism board. According to the state, we only have about 77 lakes, but that's still a pretty impressive number. And lakes are hugely important for this area. Like anything, when there's a lot of something, people tend to take it for granted. And we see this across the world, right? Whenever there's an abundance of some sort of natural resource, it can very easily be overlooked, right? This tragedy of having an abundance leads to apathy. But it's hugely important. Those of you who live in the area or from the area know this to be true, right? Lakes, freshwater resources are ingrained in this area's culture. It's also hugely important to our economy. If you've ever come into Angola, you've seen this bridge, right? This is the Welcome to Angola crossing of 69. It even has water in the overpass, right? Hugely important to our culture. We are a lake town, we are a lake county, right? This also brings in a significant amount of money. Lakes are hugely important to the economy of Steuben County. Estimates range widely. One study I could find from 2003 basically looked at counties in northern Indiana. Counties of the same size and the same population density were effectively undervalued compared to Steuben County. Steuben County was about 54%, had a higher tax base, about 54%, directly attributed to the abundance of natural resources, particularly our lakes. And if you're from the area, you know that Steuben County is different from the other counties in northern Indiana and southern Michigan. We have lots of lakes, and they're very important to our economy. We've actually structured our entire tourism industry basically around natural resources in Steuben County. So if you've never been, Steuben County has a tourism board. This is a quote directly from their website, right? This is their mission statement. Pretty much everything that they're saying to come to this county to do involves natural resources, really hitting in on our lakes. Because if we look at all the other things that come after the lakes in this recreational wonderland description, right? They're all focused around these large bodies of lakes. They're so important that, in fact, if you have questions about tourism here, you're supposed to ask at lakes101.org, right? Like, it's so ingrained, it's so important to our culture here. And it's also economically important. So this is a cool study, the Steuben County Lakes Council. It's a group of individuals that represent all the different lakes in Steuben County. They did an economic impact study looking at how important these lakes are to the economy of Steuben County. So this is Steuben County specific. Here we have county as a whole, right, in green, and then properties that are classified as lake, right? So they're either on a lake or in the drainage area. And we see that the land and the total assessment for the property and the house significantly higher, right, on these lakes than the county as a whole. And this has important implications that you young folks probably don't think about, but this also drives tax revenue, right? And tax revenues pays for things like schools, right? Hugely important. If we dive down a little bit deeper, again, going back to this study by the Lakes Council, we see that the assessed value of these parcels, right, on these lakes, right? Each of these dots represents a different lake. There's a relationship between the overall value of the property and this thing called ITSI, right? ITSI is a metric of water quality, right? And so what we basically see, and the lower the number, the better here, right? And what we see is that as we see an increase in value, we too see an increase in water quality, right? There are other things that go into this, right? There's other things that make these lakes different, right? Ski lakes are more valuable than non-ski lakes, but the general trend, right, is that not only are these lakes valuable, but the more high quality these lakes are, the more valued they are. Again, for recreational purposes. Nobody wants to swim in a green lake, right? They give you rashes and they make you feel sick. So, what is this ITSI? So this is a metric that this has been designed for the state that basically assesses water quality of a particular area. It's made up of 10 different individual things, right? I know none of you probably know what any of these mean. I barely do myself. But basically, right, it has these 10 different metrics, and we can boil them down into 3 overall categories. We can look at them as nutrients, we can look at them as life, and then as transparency, right? Nutrients, things like phosphorus and nitrogen, right? Transparency is basically how clear the water is, right? How deep can you see in it? How far can you see if you're swimming in it? And then life, the stuff that's living there. Primarily of concern are things like algae. Blue-green algae, harmful algal blooms, as well as things like E. coli. All right. And I'm going to focus a little bit on nutrients for right now, right? Because when we look at these kind of 3 pillars of what we boiled this index down into, right? Nutrients, life, and transparency. Nutrients actually is directly or indirectly related to both of them, right? The more nutrients you have coming into a system, the more life you're going to have, right? And the more nutrients you come into the system, the more life you have, the lower your transparency, right? And this is stuff that you've probably seen before if you've spent any amount of time on the lakes, on the different lakes. You see that there's clear differences between these lakes, driven in large part by the amount of available nutrients. Okay. So, where do these nutrients come from? How do they get into our lakes? The 2 big sources in this area, right? Again, nutrients drive life. Life reduces transparency. Life also causes harm, right? Harmful algal blooms as well as E. coli, right? Where does this come from? One of the big sources is runoff. This is an example of runoff. This isn't my image. I didn't give credit. I just stole it from the internet, right? But it's all right. Academic freedom, right? And so this is an example of runoff, right? So runoff is when we have water hitting the surface of the ground, right? It's going to flow over it. If there's nothing on this land, so if we think of like a bare crop field in the middle of winter, or now as we get poured on with rain, right? If there's nothing holding that soil in place, it's going to wash off, right? That's a type of runoff. Another type of runoff that we have, not only does it wash the topsoil off, but it also brings with it things like manure, right? Fertilizers, those types of pesticides, herbicides, those types of things rushing off agricultural fields into the streams ultimately feeding into the lakes. Another source of runoff is actually lawn fertilizers, right? So people who fertilize their lawns, no one will ever accuse me of having a nice lawn, but fertilizer application, weed and feed application, right? It's going to run off your ground if you apply it at the wrong time, entering into our lakes. Another source of nutrient contaminant, which also leads to E. coli contamination, are failing septic systems. So if you're from the area, a lot of our septic systems in the county have been tied into the city municipalities, but some have not. The older neighborhoods that still are on septic systems, which is basically your wastewater goes into a field behind your house and it's managed that way. They need proper maintenance and they just naturally decrease in their efficacy. And so what we find happening as subdivisions that are off of city septic age, their septic systems begin to fail. And those septic systems failing ultimately end up in these lakes. And there are 2 really interesting examples of this. Hamilton Lake and Crooked Lake. Hamilton Lake and Crooked Lake, they're both in Steuben County. They're both really popular tourist destinations. They've both struggled with E. coli contamination. And so the Steuben County Lakes Council piloted a study basically looking at where this E. coli was coming from. And they did it by using DNA testing. And so E. coli is a natural bacteria that lives in all warm-blooded things' guts. Right? We have E. coli in us, everything has E. coli in us. And it passes through our system in our waste. And so what's unique is that we can actually look at the DNA of those different E. coli, and we can basically fingerprint the source that it came from. And so what the Lakes Council set out to do is to try to tease apart, right, what is causing these E. coli contaminations, right? Is it from the manure on the crop fields? Is it from failing septic systems? Looking at these two lakes. This is important because I'm not sure if anybody's been in the area long enough. Mike, you might remember, Crooked Lake, the public beach was closed down several times because of fecal coliform contamination, E. coli contamination. So, going back to our picture, right? Going back to our overall map, right? This is Steuben County. These are all of our lakes. Hamilton Lake is down here in this bottom corner. It's a relatively large lake. It's also kind of interesting. It's also a really clear lake. And so it doesn't necessarily have a ton of nutrients in it. It doesn't have a lot of that life. Its transparency is very, very good. But yet it was still getting coliform contamination. And so what they ended up finding, the Steuben County Lakes Council ended up finding, is that through that DNA evidence, there was no human fecal matter in this lake. Instead, it was all pig. Right? It was all pigs because of fertilizer application. Right? Fertilizer applied incorrectly during the spring, right, led into an increase in E. coli contamination in the lake. Another lake, Crooked Lake, up here near us. Right, so this is the zoomed in view. It's actually right here. It's really close to campus. This is another one. This is the one that not only had fecal coli contamination, it also has had increased levels of harmful algal blooms. And so what they ended up finding is that these two ditches, Carpenter Ditch and I'm blanking on the other name, were of interest. And what they found, as this graph shows, is we have years of sampling data, and then we have E. coli counts, right? And anything above this line is above EPA standard for E. coli contamination. And so basically those two ditches feeding into Crooked Lake had a disproportionately high E. coli count. Right? And what they ended up finding is that E. coli was almost 100% from human sources. And so upstream of these two ditches, is actually a relatively large and relatively old subdivision-y type area. Lots of houses on septic systems with failing septic systems leaking into Carpenter Ditch, which is basically fueling E. coli blooms in Crooked Lake. Yeah, Mike.
How do they wrongly apply fertilizer? Do they apply too much, or do they, I'm trying to figure out.
So a couple of different ways. This isn't the question and answer portion, but that's all right. Over-application is a problem, right? So there's a certain amount of nutrients that plants can uptake. So you can put too much on, and you can also put it on the wrong time. The problem that they're finding, especially with Lake Erie, that's like the kind of classic case study, big algal blooms because people were putting on the wrong type of fertilizer the wrong type of year, and it was literally floating out of the ground and washing off into the streams. And so yeah, there's human feces in Crooked Lake, most likely because of failing septic systems upstream, right? And right now, this isn't a huge issue. I mean, obviously, if you actually swim in Crooked Lake, it's probably a huge issue to you. If you've ever been in Crooked Lake, you probably feel really gross right now. But the thing that I'm trying to instill is that, right, we can have a huge impact on these lakes, and our impact on those lakes is going to have a much larger impact on the community as a whole, right? Our lakes can only absorb so much of this, right, before we start seeing real effects with regards to the quality of the water and ultimately the value of the property. I'm not ready for questions yet, Mike. How can you get involved, right? The most important thing is advocate, right? Most of this stuff requires people to get involved in politics and local levels. So, advocate for proper fertilizer application. Talk about increased increasing soil health, cover crops, two-stage ditching systems. More importantly, something that you guys can do is join local conservation groups, right? Lend hands where you can. Also educate. The Smithsonian has a traveling display, which is actually going to be in Steuben County this summer. It was created by the local Lakes Council as well as the Soil Conservation District. So check that out if you're in town. Another one is outreach opportunities. This is a shameless plug. I actually just got a grant to do like a scientist in the classroom experience looking at lake quality with local high school students. So if you're like an educator interested in that, feel free to contact me for opportunities to volunteer your time on our field days. And then just kind of lastly, right, we can lose this resource, right? It's hard for us to see something so big as something that we can actually affect, but we are, and we're doing it pretty substantially. Other things coming into play, right, as weather patterns change, as temperatures increase, things like E. coli blooms, cyanobacteria blooms are becoming more and more of an issue. And we need to appreciate, right, and try to protect these systems as best we can, because it's really hard to go backwards. It's really hard to go back to a state once the state shifts. Anybody got any questions? Mike?
How do you, the failing septic systems, does the state check that, or are people supposed to check it? Is there any check on that?
You know, that's an excellent question. I feel like most people, there's what you should do and what actually people do. Like you're supposed to be checking these things, but I don't think there's any large organizational effort to check these. Only when it becomes a problem and people like backtrack where it's actually coming from. But that's beyond my pay grade. But a lowly ecologist.
Lowly ecologist.
Anybody else got any questions? Yeah.
Are there any groups in particular that you stand by and say, like, if you want to do something, you should join or volunteer with this group?
So there's a couple of different places in the area that do various conservation work. The one that's directly related to water quality issues would be the Steuben County Lakes Council. But then there's also other conservation groups like Acres Land Trust as well as Blue Heron Ministries that also do this type of stuff, but they don't just focus on lake quality stuff. Yeah.
Has there been anything done to combat the failing septic tanks? Like, has there been like either discontinuations or?
The first step was finding the problem. And so now the Lakes Council is working at how to actually handle that. They are expanding municipal septic systems. The only reason why I know this is because it happened in my neighborhood. So they're expanding the reach of that, basically taking people off of private septic and putting them onto the municipal septic system. But it's really expensive, right? So we're really hilly, we got a lot of things going against us, and so it's not just as simple as ditching in a new pipe. It involves pumping stations and acquisition of areas. So it's hopefully something will happen, but the first step was figuring out where the E. coli is coming from, and then moving on from there. Because another thing that I didn't mention when we were talking about that, I said everything warm-blooded has E. coli in their stomachs, right? And so teasing apart where it's actually coming from is really hard to do. And it's only been recently that we've been able to do this DNA fingerprinting to see where it's coming from. And again, I wasn't associated with this. This was done by the Lakes Council. It's just the publicly accessible data. And so we had to tease apart, was it coming from waterfowl, was it coming from deer, cows, or pigs? And then once we had that, we as in the community had the signal that it was definitely from human systems, then we could start making these decisions. That was done in 2020. 2021, so it's been, yeah, it's been really recent. Yep. 2020 and then COVID happened, so I haven't gone to a Lakes Council meeting yet, so post-COVID. Anybody got any other questions? Yeah.
Do cold-blooded animals have E. coli on their blood?
I don't believe so. I don't know though. That's an excellent question.
You asking about your lizard?
Yeah.
Yeah. She's like, oh, wait a minute, I need to know.
No, I think with lizards, your biggest fear is like salmonella.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what my mom keeps saying.
Just wash your hands and you'll be fine.
Yeah.
With soap.
Definitely so.
Yes.
I'll just use hands.
All right, well, thank you for coming and enjoy the rest of your Earth Fest.